welcome. Okay, so we are waiting for one more panelist, Julia, who will hopefully be joining us soon. But I just want to say welcome. My name's Ashley, and I'm here to present the session entitled How Different Industries Can Move Towards Sustainable Manufacturing Practices. For those who are just joining, this is the second session as part of the Cleaner Growth Leadership Network Youth Advisory Council Conference entitled Innovating Our Way to a Sustainable World. In this session, we're going to deconstruct the challenges of sustainable manufacturing from different perspectives, how a one-size-fits-all approach to achieving sustainability might not always work in manufacturing. We want to think about issues, challenges that companies and consumers are facing right now, and the opportunities that can help us drive towards responsible manufacturing. And whether we're manufacturing textiles, fashion, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, or other key materials, where do things differ and where is the common ground for us to learn and innovate together? So before we begin, I will say that we all have one thing in common. You don't know what's going to be said in this session, and neither do I, because this is a journey of discovery, and we've got an excellent panel of speakers here today covering different aspects of manufacturing, from design, product development, process engineering, strategy, marketing across industry and academia. I was going to do a brief introduction to the speakers, but I think there's no one better than the speakers themselves to say a bit about who they are and what they do. So I think we'll do that, and we'll start with Martin. I'm just going to follow around my boxes that I can see. Martin, if you want to say a few words.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite. Yeah, I mean, my background was originally in business, started in sustainability stuff in the late 80s, worn various hats, currently Profession of Innovation and Sustainability at University for the Creative Arts, chairman of Farnham Repair Cafe, and advisory board to the Global Ghost Gear Initiative and other initiatives. So I'm sort of spanning quite a lot of different things.
Thanks for that, Martin. Rob, do you want to say a few words?
Okay, Ashley, Rob Peeling. So I'm a process engineer, have been for many, many years, worked in a mixture of operations management, process safety, R&D, in the titanium dioxide, the platinum industries, and these days I work for a very small consultancy, helping people with understanding processes, be they physical, chemical, or biochemical. So we work with the pharmaceutical industry, fine chemicals, catalysts, that sort of thing.
Thanks so much for that, Rob. And finally, last but not least, Alistair.
Hi, Ash, and thanks everyone. Oh, yeah, I am unmuted. I'm very sorry. I'm coming from my annual leave. I'm in SeaWorld in Scarborough with my son. I'd probably describe myself as a molecule maker or a manufacturer of molecules, and I began my journey in a PhD making garlic metabolites and then catalysts, and then doing process intensification for the extraction of uranium and closing the fuel cycle there. And now I'm kind of working a similar discipline to Ash, in which I'm recycling t-shirts, so trying to stop growing cotton to make t-shirts and use the cotton stockpiles that we have. Isn't that right, Tiago? And I'm very much looking forward to this panel discussion today, Ash. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Alistair. So hopefully Julia will join us in a bit, but I'm Ashley. I'll be chairing the session today, and I'm the CGLN's Youth Council Lead on Manufacturing. I'm in my second year of a PhD at the University of Leeds, School of Chemical and Process Engineering, under a studentship with the EPSRC, CDT Molecules to Product. I'm looking at the development of biocomposites, specifically those made from cellulosic materials. Recently published a paper outlining a novel processing method to produce all cellulose composites using cellulosic textiles and interleaved films. And this all kind of came around the idea of, can we valorize textile waste to make functional materials one day? I'm looking at the feasibility of that. I also worked at the university as an undergraduate teaching assistant and a sustainable labs project architect. But before this, I worked as a fashion designer for around 10 years across different markets internationally in the UK. And I am extremely excited to get this conversation started, because I think we've got a really nice mix of different industries and expertise to get the discussion started. So for those attending, thank you so much. There is a Q&A box that you can start to put questions in. So please do leave some questions, and we'll make time to go through some of them as we go along. In the meantime, let's kick off with the first question. I've got a few questions planned, but there's no need for it to, I'm sort of very open to this kind of taking whatever avenue it wants to take, and we'll see where the discussions take us. But I'll open up with the first one. And this is, What do you perceive to be the biggest sustainability challenges facing the manufacturing sector in the next 10 to 15 years? So it could be specific to an industry, a product type, or a business operation. It could sit within any phase of that product development life cycle. Rob, shall I ask you first? We'll open it to you and then we'll see where it goes.
Okay, well, I think certainly in the process industries, but I think it's actually completely general. I think the biggest challenge is energy and getting the energy consumption down. We cannot manufacture anything without energy. It's all, and finding sources, carbon-free sources of our energy, so be it renewable electricity, possibly blue or green hydrogen, certainly in the chemical sector, or even something I recently became aware of, waste heat coming from fusion power, which is a novel and interesting idea, but actually I think probably makes quite a bit of sense.
That's really interesting, Robin. We actually have a session on energy, maybe later on today or tomorrow, where there'll be a panel session discussing energy, the energy challenges. And we did, one of our Youth Council Advisory Board members did an article about fusion in particular. I've met quite a few people in the last year that are sort of putting a lot of thought into the idea of fusion energy and its potential. So that's really interesting.
Yes.
Martin?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of quick things. So, I mean, reinforce, but from a different angle, that, climate change, significant drive to net zero, going to need to look at the different, both energy efficiency in terms of existing processes and products, but also new sources of energy. So adding to that, just to add to the discussion, I think the other issues are associated with circular economy issues, materials driving more value from products, materials and components in economic and social systems. And the reality is that there's a lot of talk about circular economy at an organizational product level, but once you get down to the product level, the teams are evolving, the knowledge is evolving, and people aren't nearly as far ahead on this as the websites might suggest. I would say just the other key issue for those in the manufacturing sector is the ongoing acceleration of technology and the complexity of supply chains. And that links back into the first 2 points about particularly scope 3 emissions and how you take that through global supply chains. And I'd say lastly, perhaps the other driver is, for those in business producing products, it is adapting to, a toughening and tightening of younger people's attitudes around climate change and sustainability, and how companies respond to that and communicate that in a manner that engages with them. So I'll shut up there.
Now, there's some really great points there, Martin. Sort of, you were mentioning kind of the energy and things, but also in existing processes as well. And we've got new technologies coming through, but also, is there a way we can evolve those existing processes to make them more sustainable than they originally are? When I think about, for example, manufacturing polyester, there are bio-based technologies that could help just evolve an existing process, or do we need a complete overhaul of a new process, which would be a lot more complex? So I think that there's a lot there. So I think that the knowledge thing is something I want to touch upon a little bit later, because I think that that's really, really vital. As you say, we're not quite there on knowing everything, nowhere near, in fact. And so I think there's this kind of precautionary principle that we have to think about, where it's that best available technique, even though we know we don't have all the knowledge, also making sure we don't create some new problems because of that lack of knowledge. Alistair, do you want to, have you got anything you want to sort of add to that, and then we'll kind of go on into a few other little bits there?
Well, I think as someone who worked in the nuclear sector for a little bit, I think energy is fine. I think the energy density of uranium and the quantities of uranium-238 we have on this planet, we're going to deploy small modular nuclear reactors over the next 2 decades over existing coal plants that are being turned off. You get a lot more energy density. So I think loosening up control, I think, is something that's going to be exciting. But we're following on from a session on mining. That's right, isn't it, Ash? And I genuinely believe that in manufacturing, I think one of your panelists already kind of indicated the complexity of the supply chain. But with digitizing it and using the blockchain and using this battery passport from BASF, I think that supply chains are going to be laid bare, and we're going to really get to the bottom of element scarcity. And we've seen a few examples of element scarcity over it's not before my lifetime, but at one point we said we were going to run out of uranium. So we started to develop fast reactor technology. It turned out not to be the case. And then, we have estimations on hydrocarbons. And I think it's not just those, it's the ones in the touchscreen phones, and that half of the world's copper from the first cycle of using it in manufacturing has just evaporated. Every time you drop a penny or you throw a copper wire into the bin, it's too dilute then for humans to get back. So we must take from Mother Earth and use it as concentrated as possible, as many cycles as possible. Speaking as a Welshman, in 1914, we produced a third of the world's coal, and now we have no hydrocarbons, which in South Africa, they turn into petrol and they turn it into pharmaceuticals and plastics. So I think for me, it's element scarcity, really, the atomic scarcity of minerals and stuff after we've used it in the first cycle of manufacturing. So it's turning that, going from cradle to grave and having a second cycle in there where, we're turning that through. So that's just my talking point. I will bow to the other speakers who've got a lot more experience than I have.
No, I think you've said a lot of interesting things, and like the key word there is scarcity, and I think that's something to think about when you're manufacturing products as well. The raw materials, and just going back to what Martin was saying about the circular economy here, we do want to try and get a cradle to cradle cycle, but how many cycles can we have before that quality starts to deplete? I guess that's something that I'm sort of bringing my expertise from the fashion industry, because there's only so many times you can recycle cotton, for example, in a mechanical sense. There are chemical methods, but again, how many cycles does that take? I don't know whether Martin, Rob, do you want to say something?
Well, I think this thing of the circular economy is really important, and element scarcity and things like that. But and I'd certainly be interested to hear what Martin's got to say. But I think one of the, I think we've already got a lot of the science and the technology for these things. What we don't necessarily have is business models or ways of doing things that actually drive towards that. So in terms of circular economy, we have to actually interact between businesses in a different and more cooperative way. Collaborative, I think, is probably a better word, than we actually do, because one person's waste is another person's feedstock. How do we make that work without, and it's got to be collaborative, because you can't just simply go scratching everybody's eyes out for profit. It's got to be a little bit more reasoned than that. In terms of developing new products and making things recyclable, I think there needs to be new approaches. I would say the pharmaceutical industry is probably a good example of the huge amounts and wide varieties of different solvents they use to make medicines that we all want, we all need, but they're using large quantities of it, and a lot of that is actually going ultimately to waste. And they have regulatory and other problems with actually recovering and recycling those materials. So, I think it's not just science and technology, it's also about business and people, sociology as well.
I think there's some really good points there. And I think that, again, I'm just sort of using fashion as an example, but regulation is something there's not a lot of that in the industry. And so although there's companies that want to be seen to be doing something and they're being as transparent as they can about their sustainable operations, there are other companies that aren't, because there's no regulation there. They're not being told they have to use this technology. also an industry like fashion, and it'd be similar for food, chemicals, there are different market levels, different price points that people can afford as consumers, and so it's taking that into account as well. But I think, yeah, Martin, do you have anything that you want to follow on from that? But I do think there's some good points there.
Yeah, I mean, picking up a couple of points. I mean, particularly the last one, having just trying to conclude a book on accelerating sustainability in the fashion and clothing sector, we're struggling to find the authoritative person in the world on public policy and fashion. And it may be because there ain't that many people, and it's Europe is where the activity is. So again, this is still what you see on a global scale. On some of these issues, Europe is still driving, US behind, parts of China behind, parts of the other parts of the world behind. So where are the drivers coming from? I think, Rob's point about the different stakeholders, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's policy, it's civil society, it's manufacturers, business, also finance. Absolutely important. And I mean, on the positive note, having set up and run a repair cafe now, we've run 75 sessions, 3,500 people through that. You can see, that even in the UK, that's not necessarily a green leader in a European global context, that people really don't want to waste stuff. They really don't want to do that if there are facilities there to do that. So it's not just about materials recycling, it's about changing the models, incorporating this into design and development. 80% environmental impacts determined at design and development stage. So all designers across all sectors need to be educated, in this space, have practical, pragmatic examples to start to think about this in design, technology, and engineering courses. I think it's improving, but it's not everywhere yet. I think it's also about thinking, proactively about design for repairability, design for dismantleability, and the second life of products. And as Alistair mentioned, one key issue is what we've found from our current work is that even companies who are on board with thinking about circularity, a significant proportion of them, really don't understand what happens in the use phase of the products. So it's actually quite fundamental. They sell in products into the chain, either direct or through distribution, and they really don't know how people use their products. So if you're looking at design for second life, extending the life through take back and whatever, fundamentally, most companies almost leave the customer to somebody else, and they don't, understand that. And I'll just, one other final comment just to reinforce that, because I don't want to take all the air out of the conversation, is that we did some training maybe about, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago in Hong Kong, with a lot of manufacturers in Hong Kong who are manufacturing often in China. And I think one of those, of the 10 people or the 20, it was actually 20, we did the depth interview with, had any idea what happened to their products at the end of life. Because in effect, a lot of them were business to business. They were selling into the chain. Once it's sold to the customer or the distributor, we're on to producing the next one. So there's a fundamental lack of understanding of the total life cycle by a lot of manufacturers. So I'll shut up there.
No, I think that you've got a lot of points there. I wanted to just quickly go back with a few little things there, but just mentioning the policy side of things. I mean, this is open to everybody, but who do you think are the key people that could be involved in driving policy change and regulation? Is that something that could come from the academic side, the industry side, or even the consumer? I mean, there's a lot of drivers for policy. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts as to who the important people might be in doing that, or if it really needs to be some kind of collaboration in how we go about doing that.
I'll have a go at that, Ash, if that's all right. I naively say that Europe will function as the legislator of the world as China and USA battle to the race to the bottom, getting up all of the resources and consolidating all of the wealth. That's a very naive way to say it. But you know, we need someone to start employing some level of governance here. But then you start talking about things that I don't understand, which is markets, and how do we regulate the markets, and these processes have to run off capital. And so I think it's very interesting to so early on hear that policy is definitely needed. We can't just leave this up to the market to crack on with, because at the end of the day, the cheapest way to make a product is in the case of uranium, you pour nitric acid on the ground in Kazakhstan, and then you've got your uranium, which you then turn into fuel rods. But the nuclear industry from day one has always recycled, because that's how we get to plutonium. We irradiate uranium and get 96% of the uranium back, 1% that's plutonium, and it's gained mass, so it has more energy when you use that as a fuel as well. So we have this since the dawn of the nuclear era 60 years ago. And then we've got a lot of policy in place, because we can follow those atoms of economy just by waving a wand over it, waving your Geiger counter over it. We can say, right, that's where the material is. All the other elements that make up in manufacturing, where's the traceability with that? We do have some technologies that can tell us where these have come from. I presume that's what BASF's going to put into its battery passport. But then you've got to deploy that across the whole manufacturing sector. I think potentially there's a need for, this policy has to kind of encompass ways of, I guess, putting a molecular fingerprint on these products, so you can follow them through the life cycle. But then you've got to pay for the auditors then as well. So someone's got to pay for this, and that's my take on it. You know, Europe will act as a legislator, as a large economy. We saw it happen with the waste electronics, the cable from the iPhone. Europe said, no, we just need one phone charger, you know, and there we have it. You know, we couldn't let the market decide that for us, and that's my take.
That's really interesting, Alistair. And I think you know, uranium as a entity and looking through that life cycle and its use phase differs a lot from a consumer product like an iPhone or a piece of clothing or a t-shirt like that. And sort of just linking that back to what Martin was saying about use phase. You know, the use phase of a consumer product, or, you know, item of food, if it's completely eaten or it's not, they're very different. You know, the wear and tear will be different. The care that consumer puts for that product is going to differ quite a lot. And that's really difficult if you're wanting to look at that waste equals food, which Rob alluded to, which I think is a really great thing to think about. You know, one man's waste is another man's fuel, but when there's that use phase that's got a lot of things going on in there, it's really difficult to know what quality you're starting with that waste, I guess. So really good points there.
There is some good there is some good practice out there. I would say, if you look at the platinum group metals, I would say the world's biggest producer of platinum group metals, at least for several years, I haven't checked the figures lately, but actually almost all of their production, and you know, I'm talking more than 90%, was recycled reuse material. So things like auto catalysts, spent chemical catalysts, that sort of thing, not out of the ground at all. So it can be done.
Yeah, so building on this, I mean, I think policy is broader than legislation, and it covers both demand and supply side. And so to actually help to sort of, going back to Alistair's point, in a sense, green markets, policymakers have the potential to use different tools to stimulate the supply side, you know, whether that's R&D monies that Innovate UK in the UK might have, and government, you know, one of the most powerful tools is public procurement to actually create the markets to stimulate this. Japanese started this through their green purchasing law in 2001. And part of their strategy was to start to create, you know, use government, you know, procurement to actually drive the supply side. And they had a much more joined up approach to this. So I think policy is wider, and just putting out legislation. Legislation is a complex process from outside, very difficult to engage with. You know, there are the politics of legislation and the politicians, how you engage with that, how you open that process up to make it in effect more democratic, to allow different perspectives into the, you know, into the discussion. I'm less engaged, well, I have been involved in, you know, legislation on some levels, but much more engaged at standards, you know, whether it's ISO or British standards. And one of the big issues there is that you, in reality, you get different countries or different individuals or different stakeholders often driving standards. So again, how you, and I'm dealing with something at the moment, an ISO standard around circular economy, or a series of them, where industry is not getting engaged enough in it, you know, as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of the development of the text is actually being driven by a number of the academics who have more time to work on it. Now, that's fine, but that might be slightly out of line and out of sync with the reality, particularly if you're looking at standards that deal with implementation. So I think there's a lot of issues to unpick sitting under your question there.
No, absolutely. We don't have enough time in the hour to really unpick it. Did you have something else you wanted to say, Rob? Or...
I think Martin's right. I would say regulation is probably not necessarily the right way to go, because certainly regulation can actually close off inadvertently things that are the right thing to do. So I'm not going to go through a load of war stories, I think, but where I think the government could help and doesn't at the moment through funding through things like Innovate UK is, if you look at a lot of the things that they're actually funding, they're all about specifically about developing products. What they do not fund, and I think they do need to be funding, is the how to develop better, greener products and the methodologies. And there is, as far as I can see, certainly in the UK, very little funding indeed for that. I think Europe's a little bit better.
No, that's really good. That's kind of leading. So I've got sort of two questions that both we're kind of branching off into both of these. Just going to go back. I want to talk about kind of the knowledge and sort of how to do things a little bit later, but just want to kind of touch upon a topical thing, because we've discussed sort of the knowledge in the industry, and we think some things that we don't quite know as much as we think we do, and how to communicate that, and sort of the interlinking between the industry, the academia, and the consumer. Quite topical again in the fashion industry, but I think it's definitely relevant for industries and companies and the way that they communicate their sustainable operations, their responsibility. But we've seen that greenwashing has been highlighted quite a lot in the media again recently, with some fashion companies, and particularly Boohoo have sort of come up recently as well with the way that they've had a new campaign, which previously they were sort of known as the company just not doing anything, and now they're sort of moving into sustainability, but possibly not in the right way. But when a company and business is identified as greenwashing, how much of that do you think is an intent to mislead, as opposed to genuinely wanting to be better, but just completely missing the mark because they've got that lack of knowledge? Do you think that there are certain industries where it is just they're genuinely trying, but just don't know how to? Or, you know, I just wanted to kind of unpick that a little bit, see what your thoughts were.
Maybe I'll kick off with just a thoughts. I think there's sort of broadly about three groups. So I think, you know, one is greenwashing through ignorance.
Yeah.
I think there's greenwashing because of complexity and nuances, and actually just going through a chapter, a case study for the book I'm doing at the moment from somebody within particularly the fashion sector, and stories there about retail leadership teams saying, you know, we've got to get the message out, we'll pay the fine on greenwashing if it emerges, you know, some of the reality issues there. So so I think there's different groups out there, and I think that whatever way, what is very clear is that the equivalent of the advertising standards authorities around the world are now starting to tighten up on the green claims. And you've seen a number of companies being called out for false advertising or misrepresentation. Even, you know, companies who invested a lot, have built a lot of knowledge in sustainability, like Unilever, have been called out recently. Adidas, which I was expecting on some of their trainers to do with the polymers in their trainers. But there's a whole host of these now. It's literally, every day emerging. I think the interesting one that I picked up about 6 to 9 months ago, I think it was the Danish consumers ombudsman, I never could say the word ombudsman or whatever it is, who control consumer claims, basically saying that they believe that no product in Denmark should be allowed to be promoted with a sustainability claim unless it's backed up with a life cycle, with an LCA or equivalent. Now, yeah, LCA is a tool. It's not a perfect tool. It costs a lot of money, particularly for micro SMEs. So how one gets the good information, firstly, you've got to collect good data, and then you need to decide, how stable that data is before you decide to communicate it. And just to cap that off, just something else we looked at the advertising sector recently. I've seen on Channel 4 or something, around certain documentaries, because they've obviously got a certain audience there. And at the bottom of the advert for a car, they've got detailed carbon footprinting data. Well, a lot of people are just not going to have no idea what that means. So in the sense, they're providing the information, but is that going to actually confuse people? So it's a really tricky area. It isn't all bad. People aren't necessarily doing it, from a sort of a misrepresentation point, but it's a big complex issue.
A lot been said there. That was brilliant. Rob, Alistair, do you want to follow on that before I open my mouth?
I'll say one thing about to add on to that. I think the point about educating the consumers is actually an interesting one, and certainly it is something that I've seen appearing as a requirement for funding in a couple of Horizon Europe calls I've been involved in. So we have been successful. So we are involved in an Horizon Europe project. It's about to start on sustainable pharmaceutical manufacture. And one of the bits of that project is actually about engaging with the medical practitioners around over prescribing. So stuff's going to waste, getting put into typically into sewers, that sort of thing. And also really the public, I would say, what are you going to do with those unused tablets? Let's not just flush them down the loo, take them back to the pharmacist, because actually they can be dealt with in a way that doesn't get into the watercourse, not necessarily a green way, because it probably needs incineration, but again, we're back to that point of life cycle assessment. Actually, which of those two has the least impact? And it's that's one of the problems with the education and these big tools like life cycle assessment. It's difficult to see the wood for the trees, what really is. And ultimately, my personal view is the only thing that's surefire is to just use less.
Yeah, that's the is that the hierarchy? Try and reduce before we reuse, recycle. Alistair, have you got any thoughts on this before I pipe up?
Well, I think history repeats itself, and I think we've seen with cigarettes that they were advertised once upon a time as being good for your health, and then the data came through eventually, and then the legislation came through eventually. So I guess I would like to think we're in the stage of getting the data, and LCAs at the minute, it's a case of the way the supply chains and virgin materials from mines are kind of shared, that you know, I think on the Wikipedia page it says, you know, get 10 people, do 10 LCAs, and all 10 will come back slightly different. And so I think when we have an honest way of the virgin materials, and perhaps the greenwashing I really like. I think as a question it's great, because we're talking about changing the advertising standards and communicating to the public and getting involved with the market. And I think M&S has got a really good campaign, and I walked in, and that's what me and Ash are involved in. The minute we're involved in, well, I am in trying to cut down the amount of cellulose from growing it with water on fields where we should be growing food. And they were saying how they're doing. They've got a company, setting up these metrics. Then you download their. Sorry, Tiago. Then you download their white paper, and there's information in there. And then you send it to another link, and you get more information. So it is difficult. There's a lot of information, and I think there's a lot of stuff. Kind of, it can be open to. You've got to get. I think someone said the Osmonds, and I think Martin said. Also, I would love to hear Rob's war stories as well. But yeah, I mean, who watches The Watchmen? It's that classic comic, and who's watching these people? And I think, we've got to get to that stage now. And I think, so what was your question again, Ash? Just to make it succinct before you move on to the next one.
I think we've gone into so many different areas, haven't we?
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure where we were, but we've gone into some really great ideas, and I wanted to just touch upon two things. In terms of educating the consumer, I think that's a really important thing. And I think it was Martin and Robert both alluded to this, that, people are beginning to be more sustainably minded. They're thinking about things. I worked for a retailer a couple of years ago where we knew that the demographic of our young customer really wanted to know about sustainability. They'd buy that product if it was made from recycled material or etc. Whereas a different customer within that company didn't want that. They wanted a certain quality of fabric, for example, baby wear, for example. And so you've got different kinds of people within that industry. But the communication thing, it's really interesting that the carbon footprint, does everybody know what that means? Is it becoming communicated more so we now understand? Do people have that basis of understanding what carbon emissions are doing to the atmosphere and how it all contributes to the different natural cycles? Or would something like a traffic light system like they do with the food and the calories and all that be something that would be useful? But again, the complexities, like you've mentioned, the different stages of life cycle, do we pick apart the different parts of that, the LCA cycle, and thinking, well, we've used a sustainable raw material as best we can, we understand that it's a better, we're using recycle, for example, but then the end product, is that in itself recyclable, or have we done something to now make that more complex than it was before? So I wanted to just sort of say that and see if anyone had any thoughts. But just moving on from that as well, is it better for a company to, because they don't know, to just not do anything at that point, or for them to try with a risk that they might be making the problem worse?
My view, and I look at this sustainability stuff from a sort of product rather than a process lens. But, these issues are not going backwards. They're accelerating, they're growing, and certain sectors have had this more in the past. Certain sectors like fashion, clothing, it's just every day something new. And having looked at this, I can see in the legislative side, the fashion and clothing sector is where the electronics and the automotive sector was 15 years ago. So it's so for example, so I think the key issue is recognize, and this is an issue, it's going to impact on your business, and then you basically, from an organization, you allocate somebody to start to monitor it, to coordinate it, even if it's part-time. Senior management have to recognize this and then put resources against it, because there's only one way these issues are going, whether it's net zero, climate change, whether it's circularity, particularly, more circularity, more so in Europe. But for me, you recognize an issue and you start to do something about it.
And yeah, really great comment there. I'm just wondering, just going back to mentioning the cigarettes that Alistair brought up, do you think we might get to a point where something that we think is a solution ends up being really bad, like we've sort of seen in the past. New technologies have ended up being catastrophic for society when we at the time thought that we were really solving a major problem. And yeah, sort of cigarettes, you sort of have this for many years, it's all fine, and then suddenly research comes out. Do you think is there a risk of that happening with sustainability? Very open question.
Yeah, yes, I think there is. I'm personally very worried about hydrogen at the moment, and I don't think there's and I don't know the answer, but I'm deeply suspicious of a lot of the claims around blue hydrogen. So making it from natural gas, and we're going to capture the carbon and do something with it. What? But on the other hand, the green hydrogen, we've also got a lot of very high intensity materials getting used to make that in the windmills, in the solar cells. And I don't, I have a horrible feeling, certainly the British government seems to be putting its eggs into one basket. And I'm a bit worried about that. And I don't know the answer. I'm just expressing a concern as a concerned citizen, I guess. Martin talked about products. Talking about process, I think a lot of the people operating process industry, and I guess my experience tends to be the chemical end of it, so pharmaceuticals and chemicals, are definitely very concerned about having more sustainable, energy efficient, and being seen to have that sort of process. Not sure we as an industry know how to do that necessarily. And I think there are some economic drivers against us. But I think one thing I have seen is, by and large, doing it greener, doing it cleaner is in general actually more economic. It's just proving it.
Brilliant.
Rob's point. I mean, the key thing is to keep the radar up, because this is fast moving, it's complex, and in my view, I term this fifth green consumer wave. It's not just about carbon. It's about nature-based solutions. It's also a key engagement now from youth that came out from the Greta Thunberg generation. So it's getting more complex. What I saw in the 2000s, in what I think of as the third green consumer wave, everything was about carbon. What is your carbon footprint? And a lot of companies just myopically looked at carbon, and they didn't look at water, waste, other things. So the danger is you get focused, you get overly focused, you get down, and then you lose the big picture. So I think that's the challenge of keeping the radar up. But touching on what Rob's saying, really, you still at some stage need to make a decision, maybe, and you're facing often imperfect information, and particularly a lot of companies don't want to make any big investments unless they've got certainty, particularly if there's a regulatory part of it. So I think it's immensely complex, but it's not actually getting too siloed. It's probably making sure people are talking to that person that is given the responsibility is not just talking to people within that organization or that industry. It's talking to a broader group of people, who may have different perspectives on how things may shift. Anyway, I'll shut Charlotte, because I can see Alistair is out of the nightclub.
We've just at the ceiling closure. Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah, I absolutely love the way this talk, the way the panel has turned from initially your question, Ashley, being around carbon, and then moving on to hydrogen, and a general concern about all sort of materials going into processes. I think on the front end of making processes more sustainable, we've heard about British standards. The European Union, which I was following a process called REACH categorize chemicals on the largest scale and then shrinking them down. And as someone who makes molecules have their old school name. There's 15 different ways to categorize them, and now we have this European REACH program. But finally, then, I think we're talking about, you know, a general sort of education and a nice way of proliferating this information concisely. The UN is slowly starting to step up to the plate again. Now when you see trucks rolling down the motorway in the UK, you'll see a 4-digit code on them, and it'll be a UN code. Sorry, Tiago, I'm boring you, aren't I? There, have some orange. No, yeah. And yeah, and I think that's quite exciting from a front end side, but how do you categorize them coming out of the process to make those processes more sustainable? Do you start recording people's discharges and then following it that way? So I think front end, I think it's quite, we're getting a lot of documentation in place, and I quite like it. But I think, yeah, the making this process more sustainable, we've got the UN SDGs, the 17 SDGs. And I think those are great because they do talk about sort of all of those issues concisely with nice pictures. And now when I do my presentations, I show which ones I'm hitting on my research projects. And I think that's quite a nice one to do, because it also encompasses not just the materials going into these processes, but also the social issues as well. And I think that's where, when we talk about marketing, we talk about advertising, I think that's my take on it. And I'll leave it back to the panel now. Thanks, Ash.
It's brilliant. It's the triple bottom line, isn't it? And thinking about the economics, the environment and society, which is all really important. That's a really nice lead in. I just realized, just looking at the time, wanted to just quickly look at a few of the Q&As just in the session. And actually there is a question that sort of links into one of the questions I sort of had, and I think we're kind of leading really nicely into that now, talking about the SDGs and how that's quite a really nice, colourful way for people to understand all the different things that sustainability has in its umbrella, but also just kind of getting people to understand things. And also when you were saying, I think it was Martin and Rob, getting somebody to be in charge of the sustainability of that company, but not just talking to people within their own remit, and sort of widening the conversations from people from different perspectives. I guess we're sort of saying there's a bit of a gap in knowledge transfer, in that we have companies that have got sustainable departments, but we need to be having maybe more conversations in order to allow that company to sort of move forward with the knowledge. So that, I mean, do we think there is a gap there with the knowledge transfer, and where can we fill that? And I guess can higher education sort of do a little bit more to help to bridge that gap and to bridge more interdisciplinary communications? I'm part of the Centre for Doctoral Training, and I think that, I don't know, maybe there's an outlet there for even bigger collaboration from completely different departments. Has anyone got any sort of thoughts on that?
Actually, I do a lot. I work a lot with the Institution of Chemical Engineers, and one of the things that's certainly the theme for the current president, and is chiming a lot with a lot of the members, is the question of engineering ethics. Now that touches on a lot of these sorts of issues: the business, the sustainability. Should what is the right thing to do? Even in the bad cases, going up towards things like whistleblowing. And it would appear, I think, that there's an opportunity certainly for higher education to be teaching engineering ethics. There's certainly some establishments out there that are doing it and doing it well. I suspect there's also equally a number of establishments that are not doing anything in that direction. But I think there is also, there's a desire for leadership amongst the professional engineering institutions, all the relevant professional institutions, to be fair. I should include things like the Royal Society of Chemistry. So there is a desire to do that. Whether they have, quite how they set about it, and who needs to have the teeth, as it were, I don't think is resolved.
Yeah, no, I think, sorry, go for it, Martin. Go.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, from my I mean, from some of my experience, I think there's a need for catalysts who can speak both sets of language, the language of business and the language of academia. You know, just I'll give a couple of examples from both sides. So I was identified potential interesting, you know, startup company with an interesting sort of technology. And I took it to one of our guys in our place, and he said, "All right, yeah, we can easily set this up, but they'll need £20,000 to start it off." And this is a startup company, one person. And I said, and he just didn't seem to understand that the person could just put it in their pocket and get 20,000. You know, he's a career academic, very good in his space, but he's not really ever worked in business. So I think there's a need for both sides to understand each other's sides. So maybe, you know, influential profs who haven't worked in industry need to spend some time in industry, even if it's a short-term placement to get. And on the other side of it, it's perhaps some aspects of academia haven't necessarily done a great job in highlighting the applied work. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm not coming from Robin and Alistair's perspective. But, you know, I'm running this event around, in effect, sustainability in the creative industries, and got people from industry involved, music sector, all sorts of different things, and immediately asked them to review an abstract. They're so, no, this is, they think highly theoretical. Well, no, what, you know, we do is very applied. So there's this misperception, perhaps, amongst parts of industry that I've certainly seen, that academia is always about high academia, and perhaps you know, where academia touches, you know, business and you know, there could be a better job to sort of to show how they could work with industry more effectively. I mean, I haven't articulated that very well, but it's each side understanding the others more effectively. It's
the language, isn't it? Absolutely. I think that's really important. Alistair, before we round up.
The simple one on that one, Ash. Revise the curriculum straight up. I do love the unification of language comment I think that Martin was making there.
Oh, you've just frozen, Alistair. Have you gone back in the nightclub? Oh no.
I recently
there
attended,
we go.
I was on UK catalog in biology, and then we had one term with KCAT. It meant different things, different industries. We unified them, and the girl from ExxonMobil was like, "Can we have that list, please?" And I think we used to, before the internet, we had the proliferation of information. Everyone went into their silos to get to the peak of their discipline faster. Whereas now I think we can have that unification of languages we are having with the UN SDGs, with the UN chemical numbers. I think unifying language and breaking down the barriers that needed to exist when knowledge transfer was limited literally by word of mouth and individuals. Now I'm coming to you live from SeaWorld. So yeah, I think revise the curriculum and again, unify the language. I think an interesting one, I think, about leadership as well. And I think that's a very, very, very good point. Thank you, Ashley.
That is brilliant, guys. We're sort of coming to, we've got about 5-6 minutes left. But I think just to kind of I think you guys have all been saying some really great things. Like the idea of language, I think, is a really great one to sort of finish on. So many different industries and different people working, even within the same industry, talk a different language. I know from my perspective, a designer thinks very differently from a buyer, for example. So even within the same company, you need to learn to have that language so that you can understand why that might sell, as opposed to why that customer might think it's a nice item to buy and it's desirable. So I think that we've got a lot of there's a lot of importance in there. I think you've all brought some really interesting things, and I think actually there is a common ground here that it's very complex and we need to be having bigger conversations, and we need to be uniting different areas and finding that common ground. I think that you guys have sort of discussed that really, really, really well. Before I kind of finish, is there any sort of final words anybody wants to say before I sort of have my little ending spiel?
Just one from me, please, gentlemen and Ashley. We no longer live on a planet of infinite growth. We live on a planet of finite resources, and we must take care of them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just two quick points. Whilst the SDGs are a useful framework, what we need to ensure is that companies don't just hide behind that as a reporting framework as business as usual. It's how can these things be a catalyst to change and innovation? And I think the other key thing is your point, Ashley, in terms of organizations. It's this report done, maybe 15, 20 years ago by Arthur D. Little, the consultants. It's basically saying, a project will hit a green wall at a certain stage. You'll take a green project, sustainability project internally to a certain point, but unless you translate that into the benefits of the other different functions you have to work with, whether it's R&D, whether it's procurement, marketing, it's about that internal language issue. And it's not just the external audience, it's the internal audiences as well, because, those can block things. And those can, so that internal issue is an important issue as well.
The last one from me, I think going out of business is not a sustainable outcome. It's that social dimension. And I think hearing Martin and Alistair talking about language, and yourself, Ashley, I think what for me is the key point about language and the communication is actually sharing an understanding of the risk of what we're trying to do and mitigating and managing that risk so that we get the right outcome. We actually, put a new product process in place, and it's the right process and the right product.
Absolutely, and that goes back to what we were saying about don't focus on that one thing, and then kind of get blindsided and forget that bigger picture. I think that there is that sort of sustainable is a word that I think it's easy to hide behind, and definitely the fashion industry does that occasionally. So I think that's really important as well. Yeah, definitely some really great points there, guys. I think we should have had longer for this because there's so many questions I'd love to keep asking. But I've really enjoyed this session.
We've only just started.
I know. We've just scratched the surface. We have no solutions. No. I'm glad we've really scratched that surface, and I hope that this has kind of it's definitely given me food for thought as well. It is such a hard subject to cram into 1 hour, but yeah, we've definitely scratched that surface pretty well. I want to thank you all for providing some really fantastic insight, guys. Thanks, Martin, Rob, Alistair, for joining me, and thanks to the attendees as well for taking the time to be in the discussion. I will just sort of finish off by saying that we are at a critical point when it comes to sustainable development, kind of this term that takes on board so many different things, and we've got important decisions to make, and there's lots of unknowns, as we sort of alluded to as well. What we do know is that we definitely need to use our voice and talk and keep those communication channels open between different people, different areas within a company and between different companies, and I think that that's quite a clear message. But learning and educating each other, not just within academia, but kind of allowing there to be some crossover and educating within companies as well, and remain authentic, so that we're not just sort of saying something because we think that that's the thing to say, and to really be questioning ourselves. I think Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard said it best when he said that Earth is now our only shareholder. I think that's a really nice line that he said. And the manufacturing industry is part of a wide network: makers, designers, producers, developers, business, and the consumers. And hopefully we can work together to preserve our planet. So thank you again, and I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the sessions to the attendees. Thanks again to the speakers for coming. It's been wonderful. I would love to have many more discussions with you all at some point in the future. So you might be getting an annoying email from me at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, let's see. But thanks so much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of day, and take care. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye all.
Bye.